without further ado, John, I'd like really to start, and perhaps you could give us a bit of background. As how did you get into this game in the first place?
By accident, actually. No, I had worked for IBM for quite a few years, and I was the account executive for an oil company in the U.S., and it was Atlantic Richfield was the name of the oil company. And Atlantic out of Philadelphia bought Richfield out of Long Beach, and Atlantic Richfield bought Sinclair out of New York. So there were three oil companies that they were trying to integrate into a single oil company, which now it's called Atlantic Richfield, or ARCO. And I was their friendly IBM salesman. And Jack Murray, who was the vice president of administration, they had three of everything, right? So now they want to have one company. So he said, well, Zachman, what do you think we ought to do? I said, geez, I don't know, Jack. I'll try to find somebody who has given this any thought, and we'll try to help sort this out. And I stumbled across some guy, Dewey Walker. Dewey was, I could do about 2 or 3 hours on Dewey because he was very innovative and probably 25 or 30 years ahead of his time. And he had some really clever thoughts about how you analytically structure the integration of the company. So I brought Dewey to help Atlantic Richfield, and Dewey, by the way, this is 1968, and boy, I'm tempted. Dewey had come out of one of the manufacturing divisions, and he was the chief architect, or the director of architecture for the DP group. And there was the VP of DP, his name was Dawkins, Doc Dawkins. He had a staff, Information Systems Control and Planning, ISC&P, and he had Bob Bartlett was the director of planning, Dewey Walker was the director of architecture, John Cahill was the director of data, Bill Jane was the director of communications, and I didn't know the guy who was the director of controls. So he had plans and controls, architecture, data, and communications. Fairly innovative for this is the late 60s time frame. So Dewey had done the architecture work. Now, Dewey basically made the observation when those of us who came from the DP community came on the scene in the 50s, were a lot of systems already in many enterprises. And there was a big systems and procedures community in most enterprises, systems and procedures by name. And they came out of the Frederick Taylor Principles of Scientific Management domain. So the systems they had formalized were the manual systems. And they were pretty sophisticated in those days. In fact, I did a lot of work at Lockheed at one point, and the function and responsibilities statements were very detailed by individual, actually, and that's the way they managed the company. So they had formalized the responsibilities, system and responsibilities, function, F&R, they call it functional responsibilities. But that was fairly typical for a big organization. And what happened was when the DP people came on the scene, the data processing people, we basically were replacing the manual systems with automated systems. The issue turns out to be, would it be better to use a machine to perform the process rather than using people to perform the process? And the answer is obviously yes, because machines are better, faster, and cheaper than people. They're better, they do it the same way every time. People make mistakes. Machines operate at machine cycle speeds, and people work at people cycle speeds, and are cheaper because machines are cheaper than labor in most cases. So would it be good to replace the people with the machines? Well, yeah, as obviously, they're better, faster, and cheaper. So what we did was we replaced, in effect, the manual systems with automated systems. But coming out of the principle of scientific management, they were very organizational dominant. Okay, so in effect, what we did was we hard-coded the organization. Okay, and then management would change the organization. Oh my gosh! Now Now the systems all had to be rebuilt, or the systems are all obsolete, okay? So Dewey was saying, well, you built the systems incorrectly, okay? Because you should have built the systems around the process, not around the organization, because there's two independent variables here. The organization changes independently of the process. So you want to build the system around the process, and then you can change the organization, won't affect the process, or you can change the process, won't affect the organization. This is, Len Fishkin's talked about this afternoon. He talked about principles. Here's the principle. If you want to change anything, that is, you want flexibility, you separate the independent variables. Okay? So anytime you have a many-to-many relationship, that's just a mathematical expression of independent variable, many-to-many. What you want to do is you want to separate those things. So Dewey made this observation. In those days, process was not in our vocabulary, by the way. This is 1965 to 70 timeframe. So in any case, that was one thing that Dewey observed. And Atlantic Richfield moved their corporate headquarters to Los Angeles, and I moved along with them. And I was taking Dewey out to the airport in Los Angeles one day, and Dewey said, the secret to this whole thing lies in the coding and classification of the data. And I said, the data? What does that have to do with anything? What does the tape library have to do with anything? Now, data to me were reels of tape, hundreds of reels of tapes hanging in the tape library. Now, Dewey did not have any vocabulary for data because Chen didn't publish until 77. So entities, attributes, relationships, normalization, data models, those did not exist in our vocabulary. We didn't have anything to talk about. Okay, so this was fairly innovative. One thing is he separates out the process from the organization, the independent variable. And the other thing turns out to be you separate out what we would call today the data, but actually the enterprise manifestation of it are the inventories, the things you count. The entity is a set, and what's important about sets? Well, how many members are in the set? Are they all there or not? The enterprise could care less about entities; they care about inventories. But it's a business name for the technical name is the entity. So Dewey was on to some fairly significant things at the very outset. Okay, and Dewey had a methodology that he began to, I have to tell you a little bit more history. Dawkins retired, and IBM decentralized DP. It went to 203 data centers around the world. So now they don't need this ISCMP, Information System Control and Planning, so they began to try to find other places for these people to work. They put Dewey down to large account marketing, because they thought, well, maybe some customers have some interest in this. So Dewey was down at large account marketing. That's where I discovered him. And he had his method. He was beginning to document the methodology. Unfortunately, some more of the history probably is interesting. I'm going to resist the temptation to talk about it. But that methodology, Dewey got frustrated because IBM didn't care, actually. And Dewey left. And then guess who ended up, by default, the owner of Dewey's methodology, which I would call today a row one methodology. Okay, it was a row one methodology. And the fundamental question is, how do you get from row one, even if you could have a methodology for transcribing the business strategy in such a fashion you could do engineering work with it, where you've identified the separation of the independent variables, you have the inventories, you have the process, you have the locations, you have the roles, people, you have time, you have motivation. Some of you guys have heard me talk about this before. That was fundamentally what Dewey was doing, is separating out the independent variables. So you can change one thing without changing everything. Okay, so that is a row one methodology. But we didn't know how to get from row one to row six. We didn't have my framework. I hadn't even defined that at that point. We knew you had to go from the strategy, even if you could transcribe it, to the instantiation. But we didn't know how to make the transformation, because the strategy tends to be articulated in some somewhat abstract fashion. And the instantiation, actually, if it's automated, is like 110, 110, 110. You know, it's a long way from make money to 00110. So the question is, how do you get from here to there? So we knew that architecture had something to do with it. I'm getting to the answer here, but we knew architecture had something to do with it, but we didn't know what architecture was. And I shared this a little bit of this now with the folks I was with yesterday, and so I had a radical idea one day. You know, what we ought to do? We ought to go ask somebody who does architecture for something else, like a building or an airplane or a computer or an automobile or a locomotive or something. Ask them what they think architecture is for that object. And if we could figure out what architecture is for that object, maybe we could figure out what architecture is for enterprises. And then maybe we could figure out how do you transform the logic. What is the logical set of transformations that get the strategy transformed into an instantiation? So I had a friend of mine who was an architect who built buildings. And I went to see my friend Gary Larson. His name is Gary Larson. And Gary said, talk to me about architecture. He said, what do you want to know? I said, I don't know. I just want you to talk to me. So I didn't know what to ask, and he didn't know what to answer. But it turns out that Gary began to describe for me what architecture is for buildings, and that became the pattern for for my framework, which is architecture for enterprises, in effect. So those of you folks who have heard me talk about it, all I did was I took the architecture for every, it turns out architecture is architecture is architecture. And architecture for buildings and airplanes or locomotives, or automobiles or battleships or supercomputers or tables or chairs, it's all the same. You got bills of material, functional specs, and geometry, operating instructions, timing diagrams, design objectives. You have the requirement concepts, you have the design logic, the plan physics, and you got the tooling configuration and instance. Architecture is architecture. And all I did was I put enterprise names on the same pattern of architectural structures that are required for describing any object.
So during this merger of three companies, did you apply these ideas then, or was that before that?
Well, the merger of the three companies, once we began to, one thing is, Dewey was beginning to help them formalize their thinking about how they would structure this, and they were executing his methodology. In fact, they used the method. And BSP was the name of them. Some of you guys know what Business Systems Planning was, IBM methodology, but it was named after that had happened. Dewey knew that it was not information systems planning, so he named it Business Systems Planning. Yeah. Okay, because it's not an IT issue. I was just having a conversation a few minutes ago with Elizabeth, but architecture is an enterprise issue. It's not an IT issue. So Dewey named it Business Systems Planning for that reason. But I have to. Dewey was doing the methodology intuitively, like we do most methodologies. It's intuitive, it's best practices, what you've been doing for a long time. So he just would begin to transcribe, formalize his methodology. But his methodology came in two phases. Phase one, which he called customization, he would go into an enterprise and in 2 weeks try to discern whether the enterprise required architecture or not, because he did not think that any enterprise less than 500 million in revenue, this is 1965, right? 500 million, what would it be, about $1 billion of revenue today? He didn't think that they were big enough to warrant the investment in architecture. And the second thing, he didn't think, even if you were a big company, if you did not have asset control problems, the probability is you didn't need to invest the effort to do architecture. So in 2 weeks he would go in and try to discover whether there are asset control problems, okay. So asset controls, okay, you understand inventories are fundamentally the assets. The processes are the expenses, okay. So if you're leaking assets, you need to identify or define the inventory structures okay? And you have to define those independent of the process, okay? So you got to keep them independent. Now, the implementation is a composite of the two, okay? Actually, it's a composite of, there's 6 variables, and you guys who have heard me talk about it, it's 6 variables. So, but that's the implementation, is the integration of the six variables. So, if you weren't leaking assets, in effect, Dewey would say you probably don't need to make the investment in doing architecture. So that was in 2 weeks. You can do that in 2 weeks. That was what he was transcribing, that methodology, analytically. And they produced, Dewey produced what he called the Iron Cross. Okay, he identified what all the processes are. He identified what all the inventories are, which he called data classes. Unfortunately, you can classify data 2 different ways. You can classify it by its existence, which case would be by inventory, or you can classify it by its use, in which case it's input or output to a process. Okay, so, people, in 1970, well, today it's still the same problem. People have a tendency to classify the data by its use. Okay, so not by its existence. So therefore, I'm getting into more of a detailed discussion than I really want to. But so anyway, you've got the data classes, which are inventories. You have the processes, and you define the relationship between the two. Okay, so there's an intersection between 2 independent variables. Then you have the responsibilities. The responsibilities are one of the other axes, responsibility for the process transforms the data, and then you had the existing systems, which is the other axis. So you had the Iron Cross. Okay, so you had a couple of the basic variables out of row 1, and then you had row 6. Okay, the implementation, the existing system, row 6. Okay, so that was the Iron Cross. So you coupled, actually the location was a non-issue in those days because location equal 1. Okay, everything is in one location, the mainframe in effect. So that was a non-issue. You got the responsibilities. You had the time. That was an enigma. We didn't know what to do with that, actually. We still don't really know what to do with it very well. I mean, MIT, they had Jay Forrester produced a document, a research study using some process, process control techniques and employing them in human systems called industrial dynamics. And we don't formulate that very well. It's very mathematical oriented. Still, it's somewhat of an enigma. But that was kind of in limbo, and then we identified some of the what we would call today ends or means, objectives or strategies. Okay, so you had the motivation. Okay, so you had a couple of some subset of the row 1 representation, and then you compared those with the instantiation. That shows you, where you want to integrate things and where things are common and so on. So the methodology is pretty clever, actually, but it was row 1 dominant. Okay, we didn't know how to take that and transform it down to row 6, basically. And then Dewey's had phase 2 of the methodology. Was what he called, that was he had customization and then the implementation, or I forgot the word for the second phase, which was the actual going in and building out the actual I'll call them models today, the models that constituted architecture. But that was not formalized. See? And so once again, Dewey would have had to begin to transcribe the transformation of row 1 to 2, 3, 4, 5. That had yet to be done. And Dewey was frustrated. He left, and he never transcribed his thoughts about building out the rest of the model. So then I ended up with what's in the middle here.